Okay, I'll start letting everyone in.
I am going to pin us.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it a few seconds for everybody to join us. In the meantime, same announcement that you've probably heard ad nauseum. Make sure that you have both your first and last name listed in the participant list. That makes it incredibly easy for me to make sure I give you the correct person the continuing education credits for today's session. If you don't know how to change your name or are having any difficulties, feel free to just hit the chat directly to the AIA Pittsburgh account and just let me know what your first and last name is. And with that, I would like to welcome Ben Marnick with Centria. Centria is the sponsor of today's session, bringing it home, insights from the National Intercultural Leadership Program to inspire a more equitable architecture community in Pittsburgh. Thank you, Ben, for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kara. Well, welcome to AIA Build Pittsburgh and your session today, bringing it home, insights from, well, exactly what Kara just said. My name is Ben Marnick. I am the local district sales manager for Centria Architectural Systems. Centria is proud to continue our long history of support for AIA Build Pittsburgh this year as a session sponsor. Centria's partnership with AIA Pittsburgh and chapter members has been a real benefit to us, and we certainly hope for you and your respective firms over the years. For those of you that may not be familiar, Centria is a manufacturer of metal enclosure solutions for the architectural, commercial, and industrial building design and construction markets. In addition to the manufacture of metal wall and roof panel systems, Centria offers support to building owners, architects, contractors, during all phases of a building project, including product selection, application, budgeting, detailing, specification assistance, from the early schematic proposal stages of a project all the way through the final stages of building construction and construction administration. Centria wants to thank AIA Pittsburgh for another opportunity to participate as a sponsor for AIA Build Pittsburgh, and to thank you, the members of AIA Pittsburgh, for your continued support of Centria materials in the design and specification of your building projects. Thank you for your time and enjoy today's session.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Bevins, and I'm going to walk through the first few slides here, just a quick brief introduction before we get into the meat of the presentation. First, we want to thank all the sponsors for the presentation for AIA Build Pittsburgh. As you can see, they are listed here, and you've heard them before. And again, we want to thank Ben with Centria for sponsoring this particular session. We obviously value the contributions each of these companies make to the to this event, and it means quite a bit. For record-keeping purposes, this is your AIA provider number. Please keep that if you need it for future reference. And today, as Ben said, and Kira also said, the title of today's presentation is Bring It Home, Insights from the National Intercultural Leadership Program, or NILP, to inspire a more equitable architecture community in Pittsburgh. Now, this course is designated as a leadership program, as well as a health, safety, and welfare course. And our task last August in 2020, of the presenters today, among others from across the country, we participated in an AIA Minnesota hosted event called the NILP, which was organized and run by Team Dynamics. And the goal was to jumpstart and grow the capacity of leaders in our architectural community to lead inclusively. And this led with 10 sessions. Each session was 2.5 hours. So it was pretty investment worthy, both financially from firms and sponsorships, but also on a personal level. And our goal today is obviously to brief you, the enrollees, if you will, to understand the collective knowledge that we gained as participants of the NILP, but also to understand our experiences and how we move forward from this program. So next, we're going to do some introductions. As I said, my name is Joe Bevins. I'm an architect with Strata, and I'm going to go over a couple of ground rules. That's kind of the rule for each of us. And so I'm taking on the first two. The first is to recognize and to acknowledge, and the ground rules are, to understand that there's obviously historical and divisive biases that we all inherently carry, and to acknowledge that. And that's not it's not a sentence against us, but it's important to understand that we've all inherently understood some things to be, information to be true, and misinformation about groups and other groups that we know as well. So just to bear in mind as we go through this presentation, those are two very important things to reference as we go through the presentation.
And I'm Monica Blasco, and I'm here to remind you that there is no blame during this process. We agree to not blame ourselves or others for the misinformation that we have learned, but we do accept responsibility for not repeating misinformation. And also respect. We agree to listen respectfully to each other without interruption.
And my name is Nikki Chung. I'm here to remind you that one of our ground rules is individual experience, where we agree that no one should be required to speak for their whole race or gender. We're speaking from our own perspectives, and trust. Everyone has come to the table and to this Zoom meeting to learn and grow and share, and we'll be vulnerable and we'll be challenging. And so trust that we are all doing the best we can.
I'm Elisha Mickelson, and I'll remind you all that we are not experts. The facilitators that are presenting are not experts on this process, but we're here to help us start that conversation. I think that was something that we all took away from the NILP program, was the best way to start these conversations, the best talking points, the best pieces of insight that we can get to really just, start communicating with each other, which is the best way to move forward in the world that we're in. So.
And I'm Emily Pearson Brown. I'm an architect and planner, and related to that, and one of the things that I've really taken away from NILP is not only to ask for help, which is the last of our ground rules listed here, but really to encourage us and each other to ask better questions and to ask why are things the way that they are, to start interrogating the things that we're doing in the ways that we just don't know everything yet, and we can't be expected to know unless we start asking one another. So we want you to keep that in mind as we go through the session today. And we're going to have a lot of opportunity towards the end of our session where we'll do some breakout rooms and have some smaller conversation. You'd be welcome to ask any questions of us that you'd like. So we do want to dive right in. Those of you who have participated in either a Perkins Eastman led conversation or a Women in Design led conversation are probably familiar already with Poll Everywhere. If you are not, please go ahead and pull up on your phone, or you can use another browser window on your computer and go ahead and type in PEPGH 855. There's a link in the chat also for what you are feeling coming into this conversation. It can be really uncomfortable to start in these spaces, but we're really excited by the number of people that are here today. This is really fantastic. And we hope that you are also excited to get engaged with this material. Caution is a good thing. I think that to be respectful requires some caution. Unprepared is definitely how I think a lot of us, and I don't want to speak for the others, but going into the NILP program, I think there were about 40 of us in our total cohort. I think from talking to a lot of the others, we were not quite prepared for what exactly the material was going to be even that we were encountering. So I think that that's 100% valid. All of these are clearly valid. Great. So we want to get some background from you, and I'm going to turn it over to Monica to run through the next few things here about your experiences.
So during your schooling, how many female architects did you learn about? It looks like one or two, mostly some handful, none, maybe generational as well when you were going through school, but definitely not quite a few or as many as male architects. How many architects of color did you learn about in your schooling with these same options? 1 or 2, again. None, pretty high. So we're really setting up to first recognize where we are, where we're all coming into this conversation. How do you feel the identity of an architect influences their work? And we'll get a little bit into more of what we mean by identity, but your first initial reaction to this question, what we're looking for.
First 2 answers are immensely and not at all. That's so interesting. We've got the 2 ends of the spectrum.
So defining identity, a lot of that we'll be going through, but who we are and what we're bringing to our work, what we're bringing to our everyday life. And we'll talk about how that forms all that we do. And maybe some are separating their identity and their life experiences. What is one thing you wish that more people knew about your identity, and how do you think that informs your work?
This is a tough one.
Maybe going for the big questions.
And maybe we can come back to these questions when we get into the breakout rooms too, after we've gone through some more of the overview of the material that we've been talking about.
This one, I'm more than an architect and can bring other observations to the table. My identity doesn't limit my work or my knowledge. Most know my identity. I think that's important because some people don't feel like others really understand their identity. Some things are more on the surface than others.
Mm-hmm.
All right. What does an architecture industry free of oppression and discrimination look like to you? Again, we realize this is a big question to start off, but we're diving right in.
We've only got an hour.
Beautiful.
That's a good one.
And just to be clear, the one that just scrolled by, more BIPOC in architecture school, for a shared understanding, BIPOC is usually understood as an abbreviation for Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
More seats at the table, serving all people and communities. Doesn't feel like I'm here to check a box.
Or female contractors. Yeah.
Mhm.
The built environment looks different. I think that's a really interesting perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
So that was great. Thank you for your very thoughtful and insightful responses. That was great reading that. So we're going to take a step back into the NILP program, which was hosted virtually by AIA Minnesota, led by Mary Margaret Zindjian, who was a fantastic leader. She was she was a participant in the group. I think she was a facilitator. And here you see one of her quotes: "People matter more than buildings. This must always be so." AIA Minnesota was kind of on the lead of many things, but we actually had a Pittsburgh home pod. We had 2 pods, and I think 8 members from the Pittsburgh region, Pennsylvania region attend. There were scholarships available, and there were some, I know a lot of firms also supported the payment. Next slide, please. Here you see our facilitators, Alfonso Tomas Wenker and Sarah Wernick-Schanwald. Both of them were great. They modeled a lot of the practices and behaviors that they were trying to teach us and share with us. And a lot of times they were just, going a very conversational and setting up just intentional questions for us to think about and reflect on. And so here you see the kind of setting our intentions. The primary goal was to really increase our intercultural competence and capacity. You might be wondering, what does that mean? We'll be diving a little bit into that, but it's really to think about how do we recognize other people for their differences and start to accept them for who they are and bring their full identities to the spaces. We covered topics from identity and culture, patterns of behavior, conflict styles, learning how to bridge those conflict styles and navigate, conflicting people, and then understanding how these influences our relationship through race and racism, gender and power. And so how do our identities come to the table even when we're not really fully maybe aware?
So we can talk a little bit about that intercultural capacity and what that word means. So my current ability to successfully and consistently shift perspective and behavior across lines of difference that make a difference in order to achieve my goals. So achieve my goals is kind of, you can orient it to wherever you are in life. So we can orient it to our office administration and practicing architecture and how we're functioning and communicating and working with our consultants, our coworkers, our clients, et cetera. Or you can talk about it, outside of that realm. But really what you need in order to understand that intercultural capacity and where you are is, self-awareness, other awareness, and then that adaptation phase, which is to shift perspective and behavior to kind of adapt and push forward. And we'll go into that a little bit on the next slide, but I want to come back to that self-awareness stage, which really becomes kind of the first starting point and a little bit of what we've talked about in terms of your identity. And we're going to dive into what's below on the surface, but on your personal identity, you are who you identify as all the time. You bring it into every space with you in every room, and sometimes certain parts of your identity are more relevant than others. So we can talk about things like your age, whether you speak English as a first or second language, what your race is, what your religious background is, what your socioeconomic level is. All of those things influence who you are as a person. And so those kind of things come into play, and understanding who you are, how you identify those types of pieces and understanding how you react to the world around you is really the first step in that other awareness piece. And then once you have those two and you're able to adapt and move across lines and branch out, then you're really working on that intercultural capacity.
And so, like Alicia said, the first step is recognizing, kind of reflecting. And so they had, at the beginning of the full program, they had us take this assessment called the Intercultural Development Inventory Assessment. And it was to understand where we lie on these 5 stages, with denial being on the far right and adaptation being on the far left. And I'll kind of give you some examples, and I'm going to use the lens of a sports team. Granted, that is assuming that everybody understands what a sports team, or kind of having some kind of team that you follow, but you can assign it to anything that you follow. But in the first stage, denial, you're not really seeing any other sports teams. You're not really paying attention to anything else. It's really only your team, and I only care about my team. polarization, being it's just identify other teams maybe as rude or rowdy. Maybe they're the people that you hate. Maybe they're the people, they're your worst enemy and you don't want to see them ever. And every time you see another person that is a fan of a different sports team, automatically you have a series of assumptions associated with them. Minimization starts to branch out beyond my team, and it looks at, well, we're all fans of sports and we all actually really like sports and we can all connect because we like sports. Acceptance begins to say, well, there might be different, we might like sports, we like different teams, and like we can kind of talk about it and learn from each other and get curious, but maybe we don't really go past that. And then adaptation is the stage where we start to think at, well, why do we play sports? What are sports are we getting at? And like, maybe it's not actually sports that we want to talk about. Maybe it's something that sports brings to our life, like passion and teamwork and communication. And these are skills that we value. How can we connect to somebody who's in a band as a sports fan? And so those are the different stages. And as I was talking about that, maybe some of you started thinking, well, here I am in this specific stage. I can kind of see myself in this phase. I've said something like what Nikki just said. And to our surprise, in the next slide, you'll see about 66% of us are actually in minimization. And I know personally, when I took the test, I was also in minimization. And it's like, oh, whoa. And Alicia, do you want to share a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, so I was also in the minimization phase. And one interesting part of this test was they asked you to tell them where you thought you were. And I think very few people, I forget the exact percentage, they matched. Most of us were in the minimization mindset. And that is kind of typical, especially with our profession, and our profession being oriented around a certain dominant culture. And when you're in that dominant culture, your mindset makes you think, all right, well, we don't want to rock the boat. Let's emphasize the commonalities, right? I noticed that there's a difference between us. And instead of acknowledging that difference, communicating on that difference, and kind of looking at how those differences can grow and work together, I just want to focus on what we have in common so that, there isn't any conflict, there isn't any, uncomfortableness. But really what that is I'm creating me in a dominant culture, what makes me comfortable, and avoiding what someone in the non-dominant culture, what their perspective might be, and not acknowledging that they have to kind of live in this uncomfortable zone because I'm minimizing the differences that might accentuate or help or, provide them with a more comfortable atmosphere for growth. So. And that is kind of leads into that adaptation phase. How you get there is you start noticing patterns. Again, it all comes down to self-awareness. How do you identify? Then understanding where you are kind of in the chain of things. And then realizing when you're doing things that are taking a step back or minimizing or overlooking the differences in culture or people's identity. So a big part of that self-awareness is understanding where you learned your patterns. So some of them might be directly taught to you. For example, like how to dress or how to eat or what your table manners are, or if you put the fork on the left or the right, those types of things somebody might have spelled out for you. And then other things you might have kind of inherently learned just by people's reactions when you did things. So from little on up, when you're a child and you do something that somebody doesn't like, but it doesn't necessarily warrant misbehavior. You might get a negative reaction though, and you start to do things a little differently. And that contributes to our entire growth all the way through our lives. So understanding where you learned those patterns, what they are, how are they taught to you, and who taught them to you. And all of those things play a role, again, in your identity, how you interact with people, and where you are. So as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, where those are, and that kind of places you in each type of space that you're in, and in the architecture profession, whether you're part of the dominant culture, non-dominant culture, and what that means, and then how you can react to it. And so this kind of ties into that. is, again, noticing those surface, on what's on the surface. And those are things that we might be comfortable communicating about, or things that we're knowledgeable about. So that kind of ties into that minimization phase of, all right, fine arts, clothing, food, language, all of those really make sense when you think about someone from a different culture. And you're like, oh, well, I can associate this and we can talk about this and we can focus on that. But all of these things under the surface really change how someone interacts in an office environment. You know, they're coming into the workforce or coming into our profession being kind of pushed into white dominant culture and our standards and how things should be done. And all of these other pieces that we don't like to talk about or we don't like to think about are kind of pushed to the wayside.
And I
Nikki can expand a little bit on that.
And I just want to emphasize that there really are three facets of culture. There's the shared patterns where we're all creating a behavior and we're doing something in routine regularly and oftentimes assuming that this is, you know, what we want to do. And then that's used to make meaning. And so we kind of take those behaviors and patterns and we draw from it like, hey, this is the thing that matters to us. And then determine what is or isn't appropriate. And if somebody does something or somebody is new and they don't really know the pattern or behavior they should be doing, then that might be deemed as, oh, this is like not allowed. This is not professional. That could be one way of looking at it. So thank you. Sorry for going back.
No, you're good. So like Nikki said, I mean, with all of this information about identity, and pattern spotting, you might be wondering, so what does this have to do with architecture? And how do we take this into the AIA or into our workplace? So if you start thinking about the identity of our profession, how do people perceive the typical architect? How does the public perceive the typical architect? We've been living with this idea of the master builder. And instead of living up to this master builder myth and letting it drive our mindset, we want to work to change this image to reflect the more diverse future of our profession and of society. So in this future, there's more than one image of an architect that's acceptable, that's trusted, that's admired. And this mindset really does make its way into the workplace when you think about who holds the power in your workplace, who's making the decisions, who's determining what the policies are, and who do those policies benefit and who do they hurt, who do they cause barriers for. If you think about what is the maternity leave policy, is there a family leave policy? Thinking about parental leave, what is the dress code? Are men required to wear button-down shirts and collars, and women aren't allowed to wear sleeveless shirts? Like, would I be allowed to go to work in this top right now? Is it inappropriate? Is it not professional? And who is making these arbitrary decisions of what is professional? And in our society, it's the dominant culture that is deciding what is professional and who has to change or who has to shift to fit. Besides dress code, thinking about hairstyles, especially those that are based in cultural traditions. What hairstyles are professional? Which ones are considered unprofessional? And so these arbitrary rules we really want to look at. Thinking again about identity, and if you were to Google famous architects, you would probably get a pretty similar, well, I know you would get a pretty similar result to if you Googled architects in pop culture. And it's going to yield results that are majority white men. And pop culture has really contributed to this narrowing of the perception of who an architect is. He is typically a white male who is all-knowing, egocentric, overworked, probably underpaid. And this myth really is based in past truth, but we need to consciously change that narrative. These pop culture characters, they obviously lack gender and racial diversity. And while they are fictional characters, they really play an important role in shaping the society's impression of what an architect is, reflecting current realities, but they could also be a part of shaping future realities.
The architecture industry has also, or in design even in general, has also been complicit in a lot of these narratives that we keep telling ourselves about we don't have female architects, we don't have architects of color. And some of you probably are familiar with the writing on the left. Was an op-ed piece in the New York Times about 2.5 years ago titled "Where Are All the Female Architects?" And just 3 months ago, the Carnegie Museum of Art hosted a conversation with 3 panelists, one of whom was a woman of color from Pittsburgh and an architect. And they titled that presentation, "Where Are the Black Makers, Artists, and Designers?" And so we keep saying, you know, these people aren't out there. We don't know how to find diversity. We don't know how to incorporate it, when it's really a narrative that is false. And we can just change the way that we are talking about it. The responses to these 2 events or writings in particular came from within communities themselves. And if you go to the next slide, Monica, there was a response directly to that op-ed piece in the New York Times titled "Stop Asking Where All the Female Architects Are, We're Right Here." I think that the ways that we are not being seen because we're not being recognized or identified are directly relating to and reinforcing this narrative that is not true. In the conversation with the Black makers, artists, and designers at the Carnegie Museum, Kia Weatherspoon, who's a Black interior designer from DC, responded directly to the title of this event by saying, "My work was never so in demand until George Floyd was murdered," which is really stark and speaks directly to the tokenism. I think that we are worried about seeing, particularly over the course of the last year, the responses to the need for more racial justice in society in general, but then looking particularly to the architecture and design industries. There's a way that we can do it authentically and meaningfully, and then there's a way that can be more tokenized in that we need to check this box. And that's something that we want to be really careful about not perpetuating.
So when we compare the gender breakdown to other professionals that also require extensive schooling and licensing and tend to the health, safety, and welfare of the public, where do architects stand? Medical and law professionals, you can see here in the top, are about a close 50-50 in schooling and have some drop off when entering the workforce. But that drop off is a lot bigger with architects. So we're going to dive into why that may be happening.
One of the things that really, again, speaking about the visibility of architects and our profession compared to others, is you can see them directly on television or in movies. And I'm sure there's 15 other shows you could probably name. What would we do without Shonda Rhimes? I mean, there's just the increase in diversity over the course of the past 10 or 15 years in these 2 genres specifically has been astronomical. So the ways that people are getting introduced to who is a doctor, who could be a doctor, who is or could be a lawyer, are changing rapidly, where architecture really doesn't have that same kind of visibility in the pop culture sphere.
And then the pathway to becoming an architect, we all know, has many hurdles. And while it's really great to focus on these early stages in awareness and education, we also can't forget about those that are in the non-dominant culture, who are already in the profession, and help them thrive and support them and help them to succeed. So the barriers from awareness and who has resources to achieve education and pass the exams, but also there are these pinch points along the way that can occur throughout a career, from motherhood or caregiving, and then eventually who can achieve firm leadership and ownership.
What those barriers have tended to lead to in the 20th century in architecture is, in a lot of cases, a really toxic firm culture, not looking or blaming any one firm in particular, but really across the profession. Some of the things that we've started to identify and started to undo, which is great, are things like the pay inequity across gender, the gender divide. The fact that some firms still participate in unpaid internships. We're really using labor without compensating for it. Things like unequal power dynamics and when going back to architecture school, hostile and aggressive critiques that are really creating this environment of hostile and toxic and combative relationships between people. Of course, we're all familiar with how the cachet of overwork can bleed over into any type of work-life balance we might try to have, which the image on the right here is actually from a protest in England, where interns and young professionals were rising up against this idea that our labor is being used and not appreciated and not compensated. And then, as I had mentioned, the tokenism in terms of box checking when we're talking about diversity and wanting to really authentically and meaningfully incorporate other ideas, because they will only make our firm stronger, they will only make our organization stronger, and they'll only make our projects stronger going forward. As someone mentioned at the very beginning, a future architecture profession that is really free of oppression will look like the communities that we serve, and we should be prepared to serve all communities across the globe.
So this quote is from Tima Unken, who's for 30 years has been working with community-based institutions focusing on racial justice and equity. And it reads, "I seek to examine the ways in which our dominant or majority culture conditions our minds and hearts to accept as normal that which, with cultural blinders off, we could see clearly as destructive dominance." And it's crucial for us to understand this quote in that, as was discussed before, there are these norms and these patterns that we continue to perpetuate every day as just the status quo. And that's what it is, and that's how it's been, and it's how it should be, and it's been working this long, and that's the way it's going to continue. But when we really start to peel off those blinders and really particularly look at demographics of our industry, it's crucial for us to understand that the majority of the AEC industry is white. And as a result, it's important to bear in mind that the way that a lot of these workplaces has been derived is from that point of view. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that being white is inherently bad. And this is specific to Western cultures too, because bear in mind, this varies across the globe and there are different cultural values depending on where you live. But it's important to understand that when using this position of power and privilege to perpetuate the status quo, that's when we start to reinforce this dominant and often destructive cultural these dominant and destructive cultural patterns. And that's where the slope gets very slippery. And that's where we really understand and see where people can be marginalized and hurt by our workplace. Next slide, please. And so particularly in Western culture, what you'll notice is that there are these characteristics of white dominant culture, right? Perfectionism. I think I'm not going to go through the whole list, but in reading them, I think inherently everyone kind of has a knee-jerk reaction of, oh, I've had that experience, and oh, I know, what that's all about, or I know how that feels. Now, bear in mind, this is a very personal experience, and it varies significantly, right, based on your identity. So whether what your race is, your gender, your sexual orientation, religion, origin, with a disability, there are a lot of different ways that these impact different people's. And a simple way to think about that is like whether I'm in a personal or professional setting, do these things that you see on the screen, do they impact me and my ability to improve my physical, mental, and emotional well-being? And in what way do they? Is it positive or negative? And then when I personally answer those questions, for me, I flip it and I say, well, when I'm in a dominant position, whether it's in a project management role or in, working with a community group or just in, depending on who I'm working with or a friendship, am I using my position of privilege to help promote and better those people around me? Or am I blind to this whole thing? Am I just completely ignorant because I've just, and that's, again, it's part of the learning process of that the continuum is recognizing where our faults are and then being understand to process those to make significant change. So if you go to the next slide, please, what you'll notice in our industry in particular is the sense of perfectionism, a sense of urgency, right? We know deadlines are ever pressing. Defensiveness, if there's an issue, change orders is an unfortunate term that we all hear too frequently. Paternalism, either or thinking, individualism, and progress is more and bigger, and objectivity. A lot of these things are particularly unique to us because we've all been in these experiences where you have to have that detail perfect. You have to be able to be right or wrong. That's a big thing that we've always discussed. There's not much middle ground, because the way that our culture has kind of, you know, formed us is that I'm right and you're wrong, and that's the dominant way of how we move forward. Now, when I think about these words, again, speaking back to the personal understanding of where I've come from and how I live, I've experienced these things, but I've never really felt the sense that I could lose my job, I could be demoted, I could be humiliated. The perception that if I don't get something perfect, I'm probably going to be fine at the end of the day. And that varies a lot for people who don't have the same benefit that I do. And recognizing those is really important to start to turn the ship around and make sure that people realize where they can be helpful if they're in these positions. And if they're working with someone, how to speak with them and how to work with them to make sure that these patterns don't continue to occur. Next slide, please. And this is the hard part, right? This is where it starts to get a little bit scary, because I think particularly the last year or so, when we've all been working from home and we all understand that, you know, as Emily was saying, there's an imbalance in our racial justice system and our equity. How do we make meaningful change? Because it's easy to talk about it as we're doing today. It's easy to talk about it with people who agree with you. But how do you take that first step? And that's the hardest part. And it's a very vulnerable part too, but it's important that even if it's just getting your feet in the water, kind of like a wade pool, and you're just starting to go in, it's important to keep moving forward, even with that discomfort, because there will be times when you make mistakes, as we all have. But it's understanding those mistakes and then correcting them is where you can improve and better yourselves and your community. And these are ways that we've most often seen this last year or so have seen ways for making meaningful change. So a lot of firms are developing DEI programs internally for education and for hiring practices and firm and cultural standards, educating ourselves and others, obviously reading books, just becoming more informed and expanding your horizons and being willing to have a conversation with someone who is different from you and understand that you might disagree with them. And that's part of the process of learning where they come from, why they experience those things, and then how you can move forward to make things better. And last is building the community. Is when you start to do this and you begin these patterns of reaching out to other people, you start to form a more inclusive community, and you're a part of that process. You're no longer on the sidelines and you're in the game.
So we're gonna go ahead and hop into breakout rooms, probably just for about 10 minutes. There's a lot of stuff here. We didn't even scratch the surface of everything that we talked about over the course of almost 3 months. But we do want to get into a little bit more discussion with you. What has resonated with you? What have you found interesting? Anything that has come up in terms of subject matter or issue or idea that you want to dig into a little bit deeper? So I think Nikki is going to put us all into breakout rooms. We'll do it for about 12 minutes, I think. And then we'll just regroup real quick at the end.
Sounds good. Opening rooms now. See you guys later.
Great.
Just wanted to make sure everybody's in a room. Just highlighted. Okay. Okay, everybody's in a room. Susan. Susan moved. Okay. Need you to come back. Can I join? Welcome back, everybody. In Zoom fashion, naturally, you just got pulled out. I saw everybody wasn't back.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had fantastic conversations, short though they may have been. We are thrilled to continue the conversation with anyone. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you would like to keep talking and figuring out how to incorporate more of this into your firm, your organization, even just your personal conversations. We just have the last bit here of some resources we'd like to encourage you to engage with. Monica, if you want to run through some of these.
Okay. Nick, Emily, would you mind starting that? I'm trying to get them in the chat.
Oh yeah, please do your thing. The Behave podcast is put out by Team Dynamics, who were the facilitators of this program. It is phenomenal. It is like 15 to 20 minutes each podcast, and it is just like a punch of equity and inclusion instruction, and in a very accessible way. I would highly, highly recommend you check that out if you're into podcasts, or even if you're not. Cast is a fantastic book by Isabel Wilkerson that talks about the racial divide in America and compared to across the world, how people are divided and what we can learn from that. Some of you are probably familiar with Where Are the Women Architects. Despina Strategakos is a scholar and professor at Syracuse. No, she's at Buffalo. So this is a really instructive volume about gender in the profession. Just a little plug for Women in Design. We have been doing some great work around building equity and inclusivity within our own community here in Pittsburgh. So you can check out some of those resources there. And then the Creative Reaction Lab.
The Creative Reaction Lab, they have a lot of free workshops that you can sign up for online. They're around the idea of equity-centered community design, and they have tons of resources that I would recommend as well. And then, of course, we would highly recommend that you consider signing up for an upcoming NILP session. There is a summer offering that is a little bit less intensive than what we did, but they now offer CEUs, so that's a pretty good plug and advantage for the upcoming sessions. And we really thank you all for being a part of this and for your participation. We know it's a pretty big subject, but we feel passionate about it, and we're hoping that we can start making Pittsburgh a lot more equitable for everyone.
Yeah.
Thumbs up. Yeah,
Thank you.
very much. Good presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you,
everyone.
and Tria, for sponsoring today's session.
Ready?
Have a good weekend. See ya.
You too.